Imagine being ordered to forget the greatest aerial battle of your life. Imagine shooting down 4 enemy jets in 35 minutes, alone, outnumbered 7-1, with a crippled aircraft and nearly empty guns, and then being told by your own government to never, ever speak of it. Imagine watching other men receive credit for your kills. Imagine carrying that secret for 70 years while the world never knew your name. That is not the plot of a Hollywood movie. That is the true story of United States Navy Lieutenant Royce Williams, and what happened to him on November 18, 1952, somewhere over the freezing waters of the Korean coast, is without question the most extraordinary single aerial engagement in the history of American military aviation. And the most remarkable part of this story is not the battle itself. The most remarkable part is that you have never heard of it. Until now. Before we go any further, let us be absolutely clear about what we are dealing with here. This is not a story about a lucky shot or a moment of battlefield chaos where things happen too fast for anyone to understand. This is a story about a trained, disciplined, lethal fighter pilot who climbed into the sky against impossible odds, made calculated decisions under conditions of absolute terror, and came out the other side alive when every law of probability said he should have died. And then, instead of being celebrated, instead of being given the recognition that every single one of his fellow aviators knew he deserved, he was silenced. His records were classified. His mission was buried. The kills were distributed among his wingmen so that the official story would say nothing extraordinary had happened that day. The United States Navy, for reasons that had everything to do with Cold War politics and nothing to do with justice, decided that Royce Williams simply did not exist. Not officially, not in the history books, not in the medal citations, not anywhere. He was 97 years old when they finally gave him the Navy Cross, upgraded to recognize what truly happened, when the records were declassified and the truth could no longer be contained. 97 years old. He had lived through the Korean War, through Vietnam, through the Cold War, through the fall of the Soviet Union, through the September 11th attacks, through 2 decades of the War on Terror, and he had kept his secret through all of it. Because he was ordered to. Because he was a Navy man, and Navy men follow orders. That discipline, that absolute loyalty to chain of command, is both the most admirable thing about Royce Williams and also the most heartbreaking thing about what was done to him. To understand why this story matters so deeply, you need to understand the world that Royce Williams was born into. He came into this world in 1925, in an America that was still finding its place on the global stage. The First World War had ended just 7 years earlier, and the country was in that uneasy period of optimism and isolation that would define the 1920s. Aviation was still brand new. The Wright brothers had made their first flight at Kitty Hawk only 22 years before Williams was born. When he was a child, the pilots who flew were considered almost supernatural beings, daring men who defied gravity and thumbed their noses at death for sport. By the time Royce Williams was old enough to understand what an airplane was, he already knew that he wanted to fly one. The world, of course, had other plans. By the time Williams was a teenager, the clouds of war were gathering again over Europe and Asia. Japan was expanding aggressively across the Pacific. Germany was rearming at a terrifying pace. The United States was trying desperately to stay out of whatever was coming. But people who paid attention understood that the storm could not be avoided forever. And then came Pearl Harbor. December 7th, 1941. A date that changed everything for everyone, but especially for young men like Royce Williams who had grown up dreaming of flight. Suddenly, that dream had a purpose. Suddenly, the sky was not just a place of freedom and adventure. It was a battlefield. Williams joined the Navy, and began his journey toward becoming a naval aviator. The training was brutal, demanding, and designed to break men who did not belong in the cockpit while forging those who did into something close to perfection. Naval aviation in the Second World War era was considered the most dangerous peacetime occupation in the military even before combat was factored in. Carrier landings on pitching, rolling flight decks in the dark, in foul weather, with engines that could fail and arresting wires that could snap and 100 other ways to die, filtered out all but the most gifted and determined pilots. Royce Williams was not filtered out. He was exactly the kind of man the system was designed to produce. But the Second World War ended before Williams could see combat. He was trained, qualified, and ready when the Japanese surrendered in August of 1945, and the great conflict that had reshaped the world drew to a close. For a young man who had prepared himself for war, this was a complicated moment. Relief, certainly, but also a sense of something unresolved. Williams stayed in the Navy. He continued to fly. He advanced through the ranks and refined his skills through the late 1940s, as the world settled into the strange new reality of the Cold War. The Soviet Union and the United States, allies against Hitler just months before, were now locked in a global competition that stopped just short of direct military confrontation. Just short, but only barely. And then Korea changed everything again. On June 25, 1950, North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel and invaded South Korea. Within days, the United States was committed to defending the South under the banner of the United Nations. What followed was 3 years of brutal, grinding warfare on the Korean Peninsula, a conflict that has been called the Forgotten War because it was sandwiched between the world-defining drama of World War II and the cultural earthquake of Vietnam. But the men who fought in Korea have never forgotten it. Royce Williams certainly has not. By 1952, Williams was assigned to Fighter Squadron 781, flying off the USS Oriskany, an Essex-class carrier operating in the waters off the Korean coast. He was flying the F-9F Panther, a straight-wing jet fighter that was one of the primary Navy combat aircraft of the early Korean War period. The Panther was a solid aircraft, well-built and reliable, but it had limitations. It was not the fastest or most maneuverable jet in the skies over Korea. That distinction belonged to the Soviet-designed MiG-15, a swept-wing jet fighter that had shocked American airmen when it first appeared over Korea in November of 1950. The MiG-15 was faster than anything the Americans had initially thrown against it, and it carried powerful cannon armament that could destroy an enemy aircraft with very few hits. The arrival of the MiG-15 forced a rapid reassessment of American air superiority over Korea, and it led to the deployment of the F-86 Sabre, which could match the MiG more closely in performance. But the Panther pilots of the Navy did not have Sabres. They flew what they had, and what they had was the Panther. And on November 18, 1952, Royce Williams was going to find out exactly what the Panther was capable of when pushed to its absolute limits by a pilot who refused to accept the mathematics of his own destruction. The morning of November 18th began like many others aboard the Oriskany. The carrier was operating in a combat zone, and flight operations were conducted with the controlled intensity that characterized all naval aviation in wartime. Williams was part of a 4-plane patrol flight assigned to escort a photo reconnaissance aircraft. This was important work, unglamorous but critical. Reconnaissance photos provided the intelligence that allowed commanders to understand what was happening on the ground, where enemy forces were massed, where supply lines ran, what targets needed to be struck. Protecting the aircraft that took those photos was a mission that required skill and vigilance. Williams, and his 3 wingmen took off from the Oriskany and climbed into the skies over the Korean coast. The weather that day was the kind that makes pilots nervous, with clouds and limited visibility that could hide threats until they were almost on top of you. But the mission was the mission, and Williams and his flight pressed on, scanning the sky with the constant, sweeping vigilance that combat pilots develop the same way other professionals develop intuition in their own fields. What happened next unfolded with the terrifying speed that characterizes aerial combat. The first warning that something was wrong came when the radar picture showed contacts that should not have been there. Not 1 contact, not 2, 7. 7 aircraft, bearing down on Williams and his flight from the direction of the Soviet-controlled territory to the north. This was an extraordinarily dangerous situation. 4 American jets against 7 enemy aircraft is not a fair fight by any standard. It is a massacre waiting to happen. The tactically correct response, the response that any sensible commander would order, was to disengage, to run, to put distance between the American planes and those 7 incoming threats and let the Oriskany's combat air patrol deal with it. But Williams and his flight could not simply run. They had a responsibility to the reconnaissance aircraft they were escorting. And as the enemy jets came into visual range, Williams recognized them immediately. MiG-15s, Soviet-built, swept-wing, cannon-armed, and flown, as would later be confirmed through declassified records by Soviet pilots. Not North Korean pilots, not Chinese pilots, Soviet Air Force pilots, military personnel of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, flying against American naval aviators over Korean waters. This fact was one of the central reasons the engagement was classified for so long. The United States and the Soviet Union were not at war, officially, and the presence of Soviet military pilots in combat over Korea was an open secret that neither side was prepared to publicly acknowledge, because to do so would have forced a confrontation with implications that neither government was ready to face. The engagement began with stunning violence. The MiGs pressed their attack with aggression and apparent confidence. 7 against 4. The numbers were on their side, and the performance envelope of the MiG-15 gave them additional advantages. What they had not fully accounted for was Royce Williams. In the first moments of the engagement, chaos erupted across the sky. Williams's wingmen, faced with the overwhelming force of the enemy attack, were forced to disengage. 2 of them took damage and had to break off. The third was unable to stay effectively in the fight. Within a very short time, Royce Williams found himself alone. Not 4 against 7, 1 against 7. 1 American F-9F Panther against 7 Soviet MiG-15s, with nowhere to run, no support coming, and the cold waters of the Korean Strait far below. What Royce Williams did next is what separates legends from ordinary men. He did not panic. He did not freeze. He did not attempt a suicidal head-on charge or a desperate evasive dive that would have taken him out of the fight. He flew. He flew the way he had been trained to fly, the way 10 years of naval aviation had prepared him to fly, and he used every bit of knowledge and instinct and raw physical skill he possessed to survive and to fight back. The F-9F Panther was armed with 4 20mm cannons, a formidable weapon system when it connected, but one that required the pilot to get close and get his aim right. Williams worked his aircraft through the swirling, three-dimensional chaos of the dogfight with an instinct for geometry and timing that his opponents, for all their numerical advantage, could not match. He was aggressive where aggression created opportunity. He was defensive where defense preserved his life. And he kept shooting. Over the next 35 minutes, Royce Williams shot down 4 MiG-15s. 4. In 35 minutes. Alone. Against 7 opponents. The remaining 3 MiGs eventually disengaged, either because they were low on fuel or ammunition, or because something about the way this single American pilot kept killing their comrades convinced them that continuing the engagement was more expensive than it was worth. We do not know what was said in the cockpits of those 3 surviving MiGs. We can only imagine the conversation between pilots who had gone into a 7-on-4 fight expecting easy kills and found something very different. But Williams's ordeal was far from over. His Panther had been hit multiple times, in fact. Systems were failing. Control surfaces were damaged. The aircraft that had carried him through 35 minutes of the most intense aerial combat in American naval history was dying around him. He needed to get back to the Oriskany. He needed to land a critically damaged aircraft on a moving carrier deck in deteriorating conditions, with systems that were only partially responding, and he needed to do it before the Panther gave up entirely. The approach to the carrier was agonizing. Williams coaxed his damaged aircraft toward the Oriskany with the delicate, focused attention of a surgeon, making constant adjustments to compensate for what his controls were no longer fully providing. The people on the carrier who watched him come in could see immediately that something was very wrong with the aircraft. It was not flying right. It was barely flying at all. But it was flying, and Williams was flying it. He brought the Panther down on the Oriskany's deck with an impact that reflected both the state of the aircraft and the desperate relief of a man who had cheated death more times in the past hour than most people do in a lifetime. The Panther was so badly damaged when it was examined after landing that the maintenance crews were astonished it had flown at all. There were holes in the fuselage. Critical systems had failed. The aircraft was, by any technical assessment, unflyable. And yet Royce Williams had flown it home. Now let us pause for a moment and think about what should have happened next. By every tradition of military honor and recognition, Royce Williams should have been celebrated. His commander should have filed an immediate citation for the highest award available. The story of a single pilot shooting down 4 Soviet jets in 35 minutes while outnumbered 7-1 should have been on the front page of every newspaper in America. It should have been the kind of story that launches careers, that becomes the subject of books and films, that gets retold for generations as an example of what American fighting men are capable of when the chips are down and everything is on the line. None of that happened. Instead, Royce Williams was called into a meeting with his superiors. He was told, in the direct and unambiguous language of military authority, that the engagement he had just survived was classified. It had not happened. He was not to speak of it. He was not to write about it. He was not to mention it to his fellow pilots, to his family, to anyone. The 4 kills he had scored were redistributed in the official record, assigned to the members of his flight in a way that obscured what had actually occurred. Williams himself received a Silver Star, a significant decoration certainly, but one that gave no indication of the true nature of what he had done. The citation spoke in vague terms that would not allow any reader to understand that they were looking at the record of one of the most extraordinary aerial engagements in the history of modern warfare. Why? Why would the United States Navy do this to one of its own people? The answer lies in the geopolitical reality of November 1952. The Korean War was at a critical and sensitive stage. Negotiations at Panmunjom had been going on for more than a year, and the possibility of an armistice, however distant it sometimes seemed, was real. The United States was engaged in a global Cold War struggle with the Soviet Union, in which the preservation of the appearance of limited conflict was essential. If it became publicly known that Soviet Air Force pilots, uniformed military personnel of the Soviet state, were flying combat missions against American forces in Korea, the implications were staggering. It meant the two superpowers were already in direct military conflict, even if limited, even if denied. It meant the Cold War had a very different temperature than either government was publicly acknowledging. And it meant that the political and diplomatic consequences of revelation were unpredictable and potentially catastrophic. The Soviet Union, for its own part, had exactly the same incentive to keep the secret. Their pilots were flying under Chinese military identification, disguised as advisors or volunteers, in clear violation of the understandings that were supposed to keep the conflict from escalating into a Third World War. Both sides had a mutual interest in pretending that the most extraordinary dogfight of the Korean War had simply never occurred. And so Royce Williams paid the price. He paid it with his silence. He paid it with his anonymity. He paid it by watching other men receive recognition for a battle that was his alone. He paid it every time someone asked about his service, and he had to give answers that were technically truthful, but fundamentally incomplete. He paid it for 50 years, 60 years, 70 years. Think about what that means on a human level. Royce Williams was a man who had done something genuinely extraordinary, something that his fellow naval aviators, the people who understood exactly what air-to-air combat demands and what it costs, recognized as almost impossible. The men who flew with him, the men who knew the truth, they understood what had happened that day over the Korean coast. But understanding something and being able to say it publicly are very different things. Military culture runs on loyalty and obedience, and Williams had been given a direct order. He obeyed it. Over the decades that followed, Williams continued his naval career, eventually reaching the rank of commander. He flew during the tense years of the Cold War, when American naval aviators regularly intercepted Soviet aircraft over international waters in a high-stakes game of cat and mouse that occasionally turned deadly. He brought to every mission the skills and instincts that had kept him alive over Korea. He was, by all accounts, an exceptional officer and an exceptional pilot. But he could never talk about the thing that had most fully demonstrated exactly what kind of man he was. He retired from the Navy and went into private life. He had a family. He had a community. He had the quiet dignity of a man who had served his country faithfully and completely, who had given it decades of his life and asked for nothing in return except the chance to do the work he had been trained to do. He never complained publicly about the classification of his mission. He never lobbied for recognition. He kept the faith that the military had asked him to keep, even when keeping it cost him something real and permanent. The world, meanwhile, changed dramatically around him. The Korean War ended in an armistice in July of 1953, just 8 months after Williams's extraordinary battle. The Cold War continued for nearly 4 more decades, reshaping global politics and culture in ways that are still being felt today. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, and the archives that had been locked behind the Iron Curtain began, slowly and incompletely, to open. Historians and researchers began piecing together a more complete picture of what had happened in the skies over Korea, including the extent of Soviet Air Force participation in the conflict. On the American side, the declassification process moved with the glacial pace that government bureaucracy typically employs when dealing with matters that were once sensitive. The records from the Korean War era were old, and the people who had originally classified them had long since retired or died, and the institutional memories that might have expedited the process had faded. But the records themselves survived. Paper survives. And in those records was the truth about November 18, 1952. The story began to emerge through a combination of declassified American documents and, crucially, records from the former Soviet Union that became accessible after the Cold War ended. Russian aviation historians, working with their own archives, had documented the engagement from the Soviet side. They knew what had happened. They knew how many MiGs had gone up that day, how many had not come back, and what the engagement had looked like from the perspective of the pilots who survived it. When American researchers and journalists began comparing notes with their Russian counterparts, the picture that emerged was startling in its clarity and its drama. Here was a battle that both sides had kept secret for different reasons, but that both sides had documented internally with the thoroughness that military organizations apply to all significant combat events. The Soviet records confirmed what the American records showed. For MiGs shot down, 1 American aircraft, 1 American pilot, 35 minutes. The numbers matched on both sides of what had once been the Iron Curtain. As the story began to circulate among military historians and aviation enthusiasts, it created a growing pressure for official recognition. The men who had flown with Williams, those who were still alive, spoke carefully but with unmistakable conviction about what they had witnessed. They had kept their own silences for decades, but they were old men now, and the classified designation that had bound them had been lifted, and they were not willing to let the truth die with them. They wanted the record corrected. The Navy began reviewing the case. This is a process that moves slowly, as all governmental processes do, but once it began moving, the direction was clear. The evidence was unambiguous. The documentation from both American and Soviet archives was comprehensive. What Royce Williams had done on November 18, 1952 was exactly what the witnesses said it was, what the records showed it was, what the physical evidence of his damaged aircraft confirmed it was. There was no ambiguity, no room for alternative interpretation. The only question was what the Navy was going to do about it. What the Navy did was upgrade Royce Williams's Silver Star to the Navy Cross, the second highest military decoration that service can bestow, exceeded only by the Medal of Honor itself. The ceremony took place in 2023. Royce Williams was 97 years old. He sat in his uniform, erect and dignified, while his country finally, officially, acknowledged what he had done 70 years earlier in the skies over Korea. The moment was simultaneously joyful and heartbreaking. Joyful because the truth had finally been told, because the record had been corrected, because a man who deserved recognition had received it. Heartbreaking because it had taken so long, because so many of the people who had known Williams and respected him and understood what he had accomplished were no longer alive to see this day, because 70 years is a very long time to wait for justice. Williams himself, when asked about the long delay, about the decades of silence and anonymity, responded with the quiet dignity that seems to characterize everything about the man. He did not express bitterness. He did not condemn the Navy that had classified his mission or the government that had decided secrecy served the national interest. He understood the world he had lived in, the stakes that had been in play, the reasons that reasonable men had made the decision they made in November of 1952. He had kept faith with his institution for 70 years. He was not going to break faith with it now, even in his moment of vindication. But if Williams himself would not say it, history will. What was done to Royce Williams was wrong. Not the classification of the mission, perhaps, which had genuine justification in the geopolitical realities of the early Cold War, but the decision to strip him of proper recognition, to distribute his kills to other pilots, to give him a decoration that did not reflect the reality of what he had accomplished, that was wrong. It was a betrayal of the implicit contract between a military institution and the men who serve it. You ask men to risk their lives. You ask them to perform under conditions of extreme stress and danger. You ask them to subordinate their own safety and comfort and ambition to the needs of the mission and the service. In return, you owe them honesty. You owe them acknowledgement. You owe them the truth of their own history. The Navy eventually paid that debt. 70 years late, but it paid it. And the ceremony in 2023 where Royce Williams received his Navy Cross was a moment of genuine grace. A moment where an institution acknowledged its failure and tried, as best it could, to make it right. Let us also consider for a moment the broader military and historical context of what Williams accomplished, because it deserves serious analysis beyond the simple drama of the numbers. Shooting down 4 enemy aircraft in a single engagement is extraordinarily rare in the history of aerial combat. The pilots who achieved ace status, 5 confirmed kills, were celebrated as the elite of the elite, men whose names appeared in history books and whose exploits were studied in flight schools for generations. To score 4 kills in a single engagement, alone, against 7 opponents, in an aircraft that was outperformed in several key respects by the opposition, is something that goes beyond ace status into a category that has almost no parallel in the history of American military aviation. The tactical demands of what Williams accomplished require some explanation for those who have not spent time studying aerial combat. A dogfight is not like the movies. It is not a clean, sequential affair where opponents line up politely and take turns. It is a three-dimensional chaos of high-speed geometry, where the physics of aircraft performance intersect with the psychology of pilots under extreme stress, where decisions that take seconds to make can mean the difference between life and death, and where the mental processing load on a pilot engaged in close combat pushes the human brain to the very edge of its capabilities. When you are 1 aircraft against 7, the geometry works almost entirely against you. Every time you focus on one opponent, the others are maneuvering for position. Every time you commit to an attack, you expose yourself to attack from another direction. The mathematics of attention and coverage become impossible. You cannot watch 7 threats simultaneously. You cannot defend against attacks from multiple directions at once. You cannot maintain the offensive positioning necessary to score kills while simultaneously defending against opponents who are trying to kill you from every angle. What Royce Williams managed to do in that 35-minute engagement was to use the confined 3-dimensional space of the dogfight against his opponents. When you are surrounded, close combat is your friend, because it limits the angles from which opponents can attack you without risking hitting each other. Williams kept the fight close, kept it aggressive, kept it moving in ways that denied his opponents the room and the geometry they needed to bring their numerical advantage fully to bear. He was not simply a talented pilot. He was a tactician, making split-second decisions in conditions of extreme stress that reflected genuine mastery of the science and art of aerial combat. The MiG-15 pilots he faced were not incompetent. Soviet Air Force pilots in Korea were, as a group, experienced and well-trained military aviators. Some of them were veterans of the Second World War, men who had flown against the Luftwaffe in some of the most brutal aerial combat in history. They had their own aces, their own traditions of excellence, their own deep understanding of what aerial combat demanded. The men who flew against Royce Williams that day were not pushovers. They were serious opponents. And he beat 4 of them and sent the other 3 home. The F-9F Panther also deserves some credit here, because part of what Williams demonstrated was that the aircraft, while not a match for the MiG-15 in raw performance parameters, was entirely capable of effective combat in the hands of a pilot who understood its characteristics and limitations and flew within them. The Panther had good guns. It had adequate maneuverability for close combat. It was robust enough to absorb damage and keep flying, which turned out to be critically important given how many times Williams's aircraft was hit during the engagement. The Navy's choice to arm its carrier jets with cannons rather than machine guns gave Williams a weapon system that could kill a MiG efficiently when his aim was good, and his aim was consistently good. There is another dimension to this story that deserves attention, which is what it tells us about the experience of Korean War veterans more broadly. The Korean War has been called the Forgotten War, and that label, while somewhat reductive, captures something real about the way American culture has processed, or failed to process, that conflict. World War II has an enormous cultural footprint. Vietnam has been endlessly analyzed and debated and fictionalized. But Korea sits in a kind of middle distance, acknowledged but not deeply understood by most Americans, honored in a general way, but rarely examined in the specific ways that bring historical events to life. The men who fought in Korea came home to a country that was relieved the conflict had ended, but not fully engaged with what its veterans had experienced. There were no great Korean War novels that captured the public imagination the way Norman Mailer's work captured World War II. There were no films that did for Korea what Apocalypse Now did for Vietnam. The veterans found their way back into civilian life with quiet efficiency, carrying what they had seen and done in the private way that their generation tended to carry difficult things. They were not celebrated. They were not particularly pitted. They were simply absorbed back into a society that was focused on the future. Royce Williams lived that experience in a particularly acute form. Not only was he a Korean War veteran returning to a country that was not fully engaged with what Korea meant, he was a Korean War veteran who could not talk about the most important thing that had happened to him during the war. His experience was doubly invisibilized, first by the cultural indifference to the conflict as a whole, and second by the specific classified status of his mission. He existed in a kind of imposed historical silence that lasted for most of his adult life. And yet he did not become bitter. He did not become cynical. He did not turn against the institution that had used his loyalty and then denied his history. That fact says something profound about the character of Royce Williams and about the generation that produced him. They believed in something larger than themselves. They believed in the idea of service, in the idea that what you contributed to your country and your institution mattered more than what you received in return. That belief can look naive to modern eyes accustomed to a culture of individual expression and self-advocacy. But there is something genuinely admirable about it. Something that reflects a coherent moral framework that, whatever its limitations, produced men of extraordinary capability and dignity. The declassification of Williams's mission also opened a window into a part of the Korean War that has been poorly understood by the general public, which is the extent and nature of Soviet military involvement in the conflict. The Korean War was not simply a conflict between North and South Korea, or even between Communist and UN forces. It was, in significant part, a proxy conflict in which the United States and the Soviet Union were using Korean and Chinese forces as stand-ins for a direct confrontation that neither side wanted to acknowledge. Soviet pilots, Soviet advisors, Soviet equipment, and Soviet military doctrine played enormous roles in shaping the air war over Korea. The MiG Alley, that famous stretch of northwestern Korea where American and enemy jets clashed repeatedly in the early years of the war, was in many ways an undeclared American-Soviet air battle fought under false flags on both sides. Royce Williams, on November 18, 1952, was not fighting Chinese or North Korean pilots. He was fighting Soviet Air Force personnel, men who reported to the same military chain of command as the generals who sat across from American generals in various Cold War confrontations around the world. The fight over Korea was closer to a direct superpower military confrontation than either government ever publicly admitted. And the classification of engagements like Williams's was part of a systematic effort to maintain the fiction that the two superpowers were not actually shooting at each other. History, as it has a habit of doing, has eventually provided a more complete and honest account. The work of historians on both sides of what was once the Iron Curtain has assembled a picture of the air war over Korea that is far more complex and far more interesting than the official version either government promoted at the time. We now know about the Soviet pilot participation. We now know about the engagements that were classified on both sides. We now know about the extraordinary human dramas that played out in the skies over Korea, human dramas that were kept secret for decades because the geopolitical stakes of revelation were judged to be too high. Royce Williams's story is the most dramatic of those human dramas, at least on the American side. But it exists within a broader context of men on both sides who fought extraordinary battles that neither government was willing to acknowledge. Some of those men are still alive. Some have taken their secrets to the grave. The work of historical recovery that led to Williams's recognition is ongoing, and it is important work because the full history of what happened in Korea, in the air and on the ground and at sea, is part of the full history of the Cold War. And the full history of the Cold War is essential context for understanding the world we live in today. There is something else worth considering in the story of Royce Williams, which is what it tells us about the relationship between individual human beings and the large institutions that shape their lives. Williams was a man of exceptional individual talent and courage. What he did on November 18, 1952 was the product of his individual character, his individual skill, his individual refusal to accept the verdict of impossible odds. Those are things that no institution creates. They are things that some people have and most people do not. And they are things that appear most clearly in moments of extreme stress, when the props of training and procedure and peer pressure fall away, and you see what a person actually is at their core. But Williams was also a product of an institution, shaped by it, committed to it, willing to sacrifice for it things that most of us would not sacrifice. The Navy made him the pilot he was. It gave him the skills and the discipline and the framework within which his individual gifts could be fully expressed. And then it asked him to give up the recognition he deserved for the good of institutional and national interests that he may or may not have fully agreed with. And he did it. For 70 years, he did it. The relationship between individuals and institutions is one of the fundamental tensions of modern life. And the story of Royce Williams dramatizes that tension in a particularly acute way. We want to celebrate individual heroism. We want to name names and tell specific stories and say this person, in this moment, did something extraordinary. But institutions often work to subsume individual stories into larger narratives that serve institutional purposes. What Royce Williams's story ultimately demonstrates is that the truth has a way of surviving, even when institutions try to suppress it. It survives in the memories of witnesses. It survives in documents that are eventually declassified. It survives in the research of historians who care enough to dig for it. And it survives in the person of the man himself, who carried the truth for 70 years without ever letting it destroy him. When Royce Williams sat in his uniform in 2023 and received the Navy Cross from the hands of Navy Secretary Carlos del Toro, he was 97 years old. He had white hair and the careful movements of a very old man. But his eyes were clear and his back was straight, and there was about him the unmistakable quality of a person who knows exactly who he is and exactly what he has done. The decoration around his neck was a piece of metal. What it represented was the official acknowledgement of a truth that Royce Williams had known for 70 years. The citation for his Navy Cross speaks in measured military language of his extraordinary valor, of his refusal to break off despite overwhelming odds, of his tactical skill and his personal courage. It is the language of official military recognition, formal and somewhat restrained by convention and tradition. But between the lines of that formal language is the real story. The story of a man who climbed into the sky alone against 7 opponents and came back alive with 4 of them shot down, who kept his government's secret for 7 decades out of loyalty and discipline and faith, who watched the world change around him and kept his counsel through all of it, and who finally, at the age of 97, sat in his uniform and heard his country say the words it had owed him for 70 years. The story of Royce Williams is a story about courage. It is a story about loyalty. It is a story about the costs of secrecy and the way that governments sometimes ask individuals to pay prices that are not theirs to ask. It is a story about an extraordinary man in an extraordinary moment, and about what happens when the full truth of such moments is finally, no matter how late, allowed to come to light. It is a story about the forgotten war and the hidden dimensions of the Cold War and the peculiar moral landscape of a world where 2 superpowers were simultaneously fighting each other and pretending they were not. And it is a story about patience, the kind of patience that most of us will never be tested on. The patience of a man who knew the truth and trusted that the truth would eventually be enough. Royce Williams is, at the time of this telling, still alive. He is among the oldest living recipients of a major American military decoration. He has seen more history than almost any person alive. He has kept more secrets than most people are ever asked to keep. And he has done it all with a grace and a dignity that are, in their own way, as remarkable as anything he did in the skies over Korea on that November morning in 1952. The Navy finally got it right. It took 70 years, but they got it right. And the story of Royce Williams, which was hidden for so long, is now part of the permanent record of American military history, where it has always belonged. This is what real heroism looks like. Not the clean, cinematic version where the hero is immediately recognized and celebrated and carried on shoulders through cheering crowds. Real heroism often looks like a man who did something extraordinary, was told to forget it, and spent 7 decades proving, through his own quiet dignity, that the truth of what he did could not be forgotten. Royce Williams never needed a ceremony to know who he was. But the ceremony was right, and the recognition was right, and the story being told, finally and completely, and without the redactions that obscured it for so long, is right. This is his story. Remember it.